Let's do it! Where's the fire? There it is. Is the fire sound effect too much? I feel like it's kind of a good touch. Anyway, welcome Wednesday. Welcome Fenny. Yes, ahoy, ahoy. Thank you for that hydrate, and 1 sec. I just started something and I'm already being called downstairs. Okay, and with that very annoying interruption out of the way, let's begin the final pre-reading explanation of what's going to go on here today. The book I will be reading today is The 50-Year Sword by Mark Z. Danielewski. And I'll be going through all of the text in the book except for like the technical stuff. So with that being said, the rules of the subathon are thus. I will begin reading in just my normal, natural voice. For every sub or gift sub, I will add 1 new voice up to 10 before I cycle through. Or before I start removing old voices. Tier 2 subs get to choose what kind of voice I add. But that's not really going to be available in too much, so I'm kind of hoping that doesn't happen too much, so yeah, let's see how this goes. So, front cover, Mark Z. Danielewski, The 50-Year Sword. Back cover, 1 sword will kill a season. 1 will kill a country. 1 I'm making now will kill even an idea. Inside flap on the front side. 1 Halloween night, at a party held at an East Texas ranch house, a local seamstress named Chintana finds herself thrown into the role of chaperone for 5 rambunctious orphans. Not surprisingly, the children's energies prove barely containable, even with the promise of cake and a storyteller. The storyteller, however, is not what anyone expects. Looming and cloaked in dark, he entertains the orphans with a tale twisted out of vengeance and violence. He does not come empty-handed either. At their feet he sets a long, narrow box, sealed with 5 latches. I am a bad man, with a very black heart, he warns them. And it was only that badness and blackness which forced me to seek out what I have carried now, for many years, and brought this night for you. An unsettling thing to say to anyone, especially to children. But as Chintana soon discovers, this is just the beginning. Her concerns only mount as the storyteller offers more and more menacing details about what consequences lie hidden within that long, narrow box. To make matters worse, the orphans, one by one, lean forward and lift the latches. Inside flap on the backside. Originally published as a large-sized limited edition and subsequently performed only on Halloween night as a live shadow show, the 50-Year Sword is finally available in hardcover, complete with newly stitched illustrations and autumnal quotation marks. Mark Z. Danielewski was born in New York City and lives in Los Angeles. He is the author of House of Leaves and Only Revolutions. Excuse me. It also bears mentioning the book jacket that I've got, which is off because I don't want to damage it. It's all textured. It's got it's full of holes, which are meant to indicate the theme of sewing. So I'm going to go set that aside now, which you can't see, obviously. Here we are, the 50-Year Sword. And there are 5 different colors of quotation marks that are important here. And I will not be saying which is which at any time. But for the sake of clarity, on this front page, this says the 50-Year Sword is by brown quotation marks, yellow quotation marks, red quotation marks, black quotation marks, and finally orange quotation marks. I'm going to read a little bit of the copyrighted page. The 50-Year Sword. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or locales, is entirely coincidental. Let's see. Other interesting things. Under genres, it is described as 1. Children's fiction. 2. Revenge fiction. 3. Texas East fiction. We see on the back, because this is on the back of the page where we saw the quotation marks for the first time, we can see a little bit of the quotation marks stitched from the back, which is a neat little detail, which I am just describing, so I don't know how much that comes up, or how much that comes through. And the dedication is for an unfinished embroidery of a butterfly. I won't be describing all of the illustrations, but some of these are very interesting, very cool, very nice. This next illustration is of the hilt of a sword. And then, maybe because... Okay, and on the opposite side of the sword, we have, written in the shape of the sword, this. Maybe because the history of any ghost story is a ghost story unto itself, which is to say another story completely. Assuming any of what follows can rightly even be considered a ghost story, rather than delve into the devices and biases and oddly canted idiom of the five persons, one of whom in the early years slept with another and now endlessly wonders about the lakes of fall, where someone else once watered, two of whom still nurture their affection for one another, expressing so in an array of notes and overseas phone calls, a fourth who lost three, and the last of whom from the prison of a later life hates them all, or represent them throughout with characterizing phrases, temporal references, and even more quotation marks hopelessly nested within reiterating nests of still more marks. To delineate their respective and independently conducted interviews, colored quotation marks are used instead. Brown, yellow, orange, red, and black. Each 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, respectively. Where no quotations appear, only the worst should be assumed. An interruption by someone other than one of the before-mentioned persons. The reader, or even the author, who, additionally, it must be stated, has done nothing more than lend together these gathered and re-related bits, so as to here present a pretty peculiar, and perhaps altogether alternate history, of one October evening in East Texas. And that is signed M.D. We start on the yellow quotation mark. It also bears mentioning there are distinct chapters in that at the beginning of each chapter there's one bigger stitched quotation mark. But that's the only real distinguishing point. Anyway, and I will mention which quotation mark is on each chapter. I just won't mention all of the quotation marks, because if I did that, we'd be here all day. Yellow quotation mark begins with, "No matter how you cut it, no matter, Chintana near didn't accept. Only at the last moment, for reasons vague, if vaguely professional, did she force from herself a reply. In the affirmative, obviously, to accepitate. Yes, accept the invitation. Mose Dettledown's invitation." Fact is, what Chintana had discovered since the divorce was that most everything required force. Opening her eyes, even opening her medicine cabinet. Forced open the can of bitter tea leaves. Forced back the tough tongues of those walking shoes she kept perched by a birdcage. Force even a smirk she hoped could serve, temporarily at least, as a not-so-scored and heart-hunted a simile. Especially when the acknowledgement of something she recognized as social duty she was forced to acknowledge, yet again to yet another insubtrusive customer, her husband Pravitt's surprising departure. Pravitt. Force back something else, too. Mustn't forget that the terrible agony she wished day out and day in to lash across the throat of anyone who forced from her all such incessant acts of acknowledging in the first place. Despite pacific beliefs, only infliction promised her peace. And for sure, as Chintana had found out, what came most effortlessly to her nowadays had already happened, but 5 weeks earlier when the scissors, doing their happy skew across the bias of a patent lawyer's drapes, dancing silvery sharp through the separating cotton, arrested finally when their metal V wedged deep into her soft thumb. She lost the nail, but the local hand surgeon stitched back the flap. Taped on a butterfly for good measure, too. and she had forced herself to thank him, and somehow carry on. But she did not then, as she could not now, seem to acknowledge to herself just how easily she could have seen it hap to someone else's thumb. And so, of course, Chintana had once more reconsiderated whether or not she'd make it to Mose Settledown's Halloween party. And it seems she probably would have taken a miss had it not been for her twin Stitchimicated in Austin, who had sternly counseled, risk it. So Chintana had risked it, preparing her bitter tea and swallowing hard before leaving behind the thread and machines of her trade, her unoccupied cage, all but to Quitman, on 182 East, driving its stabbing hope through the fallen dark. And now we're at the red quotation mark. Chintana always found the particulars of Mose Settledown's gatherings odd. But what else could one expect from a 112-year-old nut job, still at ease in those in those deteriorating ribs of her East Texas remove, slunk down amidst the hickory and Mexican wild plum? A few times a year, Mose would generously serve up booze and sweet to fortify the many strangers against the expected strangeness of her minglings, where someone like Chintana, a seamstress, could find herself deflecting the advances of an inebriated city alderman. Mose, though, rarely appeared herself. In fact, running into her at all, certainly tonight, would be like crossing up with a ghost. Though a ghost would be nice, crossing up with a ghost, thought Chintana, was about the only thing that would keep her from cutting her own appearance short. In fact, Chintana had only gotten as far as the coat rack when she thought for the third and last time about retreating. This being so because the very first person, not the third or even the second, but the very first person she was forced to smile at, was the already smirking Belinda Kite. Belinda! Right there in Mose Settledown's foyer atrium, Belinda Kite eyeing Chintana's entrance with a shearing scrutiny, more red-eyed than a coyote sniffing a salt block in drought. Bangle rattle arm and twisting rattler mean into her side, gums receding around the dead shine of her teeth like, well now if it isn't Ms. Lost and Let Down, Belinda Kite might have snipped, or more benignly. Deliveries in back, or just a lucky carnal cluckety-click. And maybe something like so did actually trickle her teeth-tickling lips. But it never got no further. Not that night. And what a cold, cold night it had already become. Because the sharpest tongue in East Texas knew better. One word, even the slightest indecitation of intimacy, could very well have brought about her own extinction. And oh, had the two women actually touched, a pat perhaps, oh, something slight in passing, oh, the result would have been cataclysmic, even worse, unimaginable. And so right there on the spot, those pocketed eyes, flittering nervously around like a murder of crows, told Chintana, Belinda Kite knew exactly what she had become. Here then was another consequence of Belinda Kite's stolen times with Pravit. Belinda Kite, who could routinely make anyone cry from Fort Worth to Nacogdoches, who most certainly would make some poor wretch cry tonight, who saw right then, right there, right square in the middle of Mose Settledown's foyer atrium, something she could not challenge or even reach for, and so practically ran scurrying backwards, pocketed eyes flying off to a side, until all of her was sidewinding gone for the stammer of guests in the back. Chintana shook and sighed and reconsiderated her twin's counsel. Maybe some things aren't worth the risk. And then along came the little ones, and that sure put a change in her. After all, what did they know about risk, or care for that matter? They were too young. Their play, the privacy of that practical mayhem and racket protected them. Zigzagging this way, their way, dash down diversion fast across a dining room. Eastern cottontail, sweet Bobby Bob Whites. Down some stairs, spinning sideways, socks slipping them up on the smooth grooved floors. But those small hands always grabbing fast enough. Possum gripped for a corner, just in time to catch the slide and swing them in a celebrating arc towards another warped hall. And sure come spring, the wraparound porch outside its gape at the sweet gum. Loblolly pine and maple could serve their turns. Pernicent turns. But tonight, with a wind already whipping up something wrong, the dogs howling in their kennels, 5 such orphans confined their tie-dye hues to the shadow of adult conversation and back rooms steeped in abandonment. Theirs was abandonment's insurrection, the coup de grace of feral play. And so they flung themselves panting and rosy past the foyer door, astride their steeds, Styx Palomino, buckskin, sorrel, bay and black, and Chintana felt herself warm and ease. Here was enough. They were enough. And even if Chintana wasn't quite able to put her thumb on it, how strange still that just 5 orphans, with but the pitter-patter of their footsteps, on such an instance, after such an incident, could catch stitch, a bit at least, the lacerations of grief 6 months continued to inflict. Their offer somehow different from everything else. Something mock-felled and clean, as if to say, or so it seemed, there was time. There was time. Yes, there was still time. So maybe Chintana had misconstrued Mose Dettledown's invitation after all. Wallops of scotch, dear. Don't deprive yourself of the pleasures of my company, or my good cheer. Maybe Mose hadn't been insinuating matching pleasures with a local stonecutter, or silo manufacturer. Or, for that matter, saber rattling with the likes of Belinda Kite. Maybe Mose had only implicited the pleasure of these 5. So Chintana shed her grave coat, along with the cold still slicing across the fields, down through the fallen redbud and trumpet creeper, and fast enough found herself chatting with the social worker trailing the stampede, where she learned that this year Dettledown's Halloween would end at midnight with someone's birthday. Whose? Chintana wondering, stuffing her wool scarf into her coat sleeve. Stitch in my side if I know, shrugged the sleepy social worker. My tired feet. They're a handful. Oh, sweetie, if only I could get my hands on them to say. Chintana offered to find coffee, and when the social worker's eyes responded, quick-lit bobcat bright with a yes, Chintana happily headed off, threading her way through the crowd and the ever-helter of severed mutters, mightier than and unkindest of all. Dull, though. Of course I mean the dam. Ask us. Parrying on the way, a lutching Bob Sandwin Park Ranger, and even an I want to cut up a rug with you gas station owner, swaying on fumes while wheezing about tax cuts and that damn oak lease. Until she was, in Time Saves 9, to the quick nickety-nick-nick, real tranche de la vie, her edging in on tankards of steaming bean brew and cider, where Chintana overheard from a car dealer and taxidermist that the birthday in question was a champagne birthday, and a 50th birthday no less. Not surprised she was carved out at midnight, one said. She insisted to the second, said to the other, for none other than that bitch witch Belinda Kite. There's the page. Okay. We are now on, I believe, the black one. The black quotation marks, which I'm thinking are actually more of a dark brown now that I'm looking. I'm going to take a quick sip real quick. And if there are no comments, I shall proceed. It bears mentioning this is a very quick read. Oh, thank you for the hydrate. I probably needed to. It bears mentioning this is a very quick read. I'm already through 44 pages. 44 out of 285. And it's been only half an hour, so we'll be here for a little bit, but it's not that bad. It's actually a pretty quick... Like, there's... Like, some pages have, like, 2 lines on them. Like, it'll still be probably a couple hours. I would guess 3 to 4 hours. But it's still some pretty substantial content. And also do take up Keybot's spirit on his offer to read along. This is a very good book that is very worth buying. Especially if you want to see all the illustrations, which are very, very pretty. And I'm told that specifically the iOS version is the definitive version of this book. Like, the Kindle version is basically just a PDF. Anyway. Let us continue. With the dark brown quotation mark. Chintana all too gladly retreated to the quieter reaches and vacancies of the ranch, her cupped take sloshing in hand, mind made up to leave long before midnight, refinding at last the orphans dricketing on, furniture and walls, like so many mad pileated woodpeckers. Beaver busy, too many hours, shumed the social worker, gratefully acceptating Chintana's concoctions. Don't know how much longer I can do this. I've got my own kids, too, to keep after, so... But I guess these also are worth the extra coffee and sugar, Chintana finished. I imagine they are the sugar. And right then, a young boy, frenzied as a storm-startled wood squirrel, dashed over. Can we stay for the party? If we did, Tarf, you would have to sit with the adults and talk with the adults, and act like an adult. No fidgets or fusses, not one peep. And that sure made 9-year-old Tarf fidget plenty, which hardly curtailed the 4-year-old girl's cottontail curiosities. But what about the supwise? Izad, Inyeda, Sithis, the social worker called out to the 2 8-year-olds and 7-year-old in mid-raccoon frolic. Cutting decks, scattering decks of long-ago ravaged cards, our missit to the social worker continued, has asked about the surprise. But I'm only going to say this once. And so the orphans rerounded, collided, a sudden blue jay of a rarity wheeling as one before finally setting on the fence of quiet attention. Yes, Mose Dettledown has arranged a surprise. A special surprise for you and the other young'uns this night. But weather seems playing for some delay here, so we'll need to show some patience. Until then, there is the matter of some cake. Whereupon, and near instantly too, Chintana was lost in the squirrel and riot of squeals and shouts, until, just as suddenly, they were gone. Tarf, Izad, Inyedia, Sithis, and it'll miss it. 5 white-tailed deer in race, fleetly bounding by and around the knees of minglers and newcomers, racing slick-switch quick down long halls far and away. Whippoorwill, cedar waxings on air. Strayed at last for those far-away kitchen doors, battering out large slices of buttery light. Could lose a hand, Chintana laughed. Could lose more than that, the social worker gleamed. What sort of surprise is it this year, anyway? And the social worker, already trudging after the orphans, shrugged. Just a storyteller. And now that we're on the yellow once again, I'll say, it should be mentioned there are a lot of words here that are spelled oddly in ways that seem meaningful. And so I will be pronouncing those as they are spelled rather than as they would normally be spelled. So, like earlier I said coupe de grace. I know that was a misspelling of coup de grace, but I get the feeling that they're all meant to reflect how the characters would be pronouncing them. Anyway, yellow continues. Breath, gentleness, and gratitude, Chintana's twin typically counseled, must precede love. She was a yoga body meditating low-carb, Tibet-trekking cat lover, and a butcher to boot. That's why, before any heart stuff, voice happily prick-stitching the shifting cellular connection, you first breathe and thank, and practice breathing and thanking, and gently too, with every breath. Chintana had tried to practice, but just breathing required so much force that it was almost inconceivable to imagine gratitude, let alone gentleness. And anyway, gratitude for what or who? What about Belinda Kite? Belinda Kite? Belinda Kite! The idea rushed spouts of color to her face. That lavish creature of bleach and gold, proudly pedigreed in the bloodlines of Texas bullery with a predatory, if crustatory taste. For minor men of all sports, usually not citizens neither, offering the poor minority the charity of her shape and touch, offering them their reverie, who would as casually buy a Mercedes and as dole out mercy every other year. Her mercy last year in the back seat of her SUV with one of those boat people. A Thai flowerman married to a Thai seamstress, a tight, muddy man who would tenderly lift fields of wild lupine, blackberry lily, and lush evening primrose from the grieving earth. Neither Chintana nor the marriage could afford that kind of Mercedes, or survive that kind of mercy. Pravitt never had the chance, and the loss of some larger dream for him, some cultural intertwining, collusion, coupled with the betrayal, Belinda Kite's and his own, left him too cut up inside, all so gutted and gutless after all, to carry on. And to have him, all Belinda had to do was press into his cupped hands a frail bit of embroidery her own fingers had clumsily threaded, and at points bled upon, barely managing with cruel white work a forbidden stitch, the smocking shade of a single harvester with dark orange wings. To leave him, though, and soon after too, Belinda Kite was far more bloodless. A pasty, blue-eyed ex-officer, explaining in diligent tones how even stepping towards a doorbell could be read as trespassing, and so punishable by law. Chintana found out every disconcerting detail and even, snip snip, undid, clip clip, stitch by stitch, the offending thief, intoxicant, spell-casting lure. Because Chintana had been the only one Pravit knew well enough to confess his torture to. When he left in April, flights of green-backed herons shrieking in his brow told her what he'd already made of his wife. But the falling egret on his lips also told her he had finally stopped bleeding inside. He could smile vaguely again, limply clap her hand with his 2 riverbed hands, nodding gratefully only because, like the desiccating rose of his flowers and tears, black crashes, all of it now, mere shadows on the gray. He too, like a passing day, was already gone. Oh no, there are black quotes. They just look a little bit different on each page. Yeah, so thank you for the hydrate, Cinemax. Thank you very much. And thank you, Keybot, for once again plugging. We're seeing here now we've got another illustration here that is especially interesting because it is the dedication, but a little bit more completed. There's a little bit of stitching now that's ready to and it's beginning to take shape. Anyway, Black continues the story, and I think this is Black's first time talking. So let's give them a listen. The social worker had mentioned other young'uns, but that night Chintana saw no sign of any more. Maybe the increasing cold, or the peculiar threat of a storm, or Belinda Kite's birthday had turned parents from wrestling with seatbelts and car seats, from those oh-so-many lists of babysitters tacked conveniently by a phone. Chintana rubbed the violent line on her thumb as a woman with topaz clamped on her ears. But where did I leave off? With topaz clamped on her ears. I'm messing up. As a woman with topaz clamped on her ears burst past her towards a small bathroom tucked under the main stairs. Such a hateful whore, the woman stutter sobbed to Chintana. To no one in particular, diving for the comforts of lock and running water. Whereupon Chintana's thumb abruptly began to soar a little, and she felt bleak, as if 1,000 vengeances upon vengeances were dicing her suddenly into hail. Though the cause was none too mysterious, the front door just stood open, though when it had been flung so, Chintana would never remember. The porch lights were extinguished too, oddly, and what's more, a shadow now cut across the threshold, though without moon or stars in the Texas sky, this was an awful impossibility, for here, reaching towards her, it seemed it was a shadow cast by nothing other than the darkness itself. Most would have denied the sight with a turn, a cry, flight, but maybe Chintana too, day out and day in, could so easily consider doing the same. What would leave these rooms drenched in silence and blood? she welcomed him. "The orphans," was all he said, and Chintana showed him the way. At first, the 5 orphans, 5 jittery swamp rabbits, 5 know-some-better gophers recoiled at the sight of the storyteller. It didn't help that the library had not suited his tastes, so his hulking form, bent and growling, had led them up a tight wind of back stairs into a small parlor already dimly lit with 5 season-poured candles of ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and molasses, clustered in an uneven arc away from the 5 dark windows, all tightly closed. Surely Moses' work. Only when he finally sat down on the floor did the orphans seem to relax, enchanted quick enough by the manner of his diminishing. So crossing his legs, folding himself into himself, refolding until right after their eyes he no longer seemed howling or gulking, but sat quiet still, overdraped in his strange silvery black tunic, his head heavily bowed. Following this example, Tarf, Izad, Inyadia, Sithis, and Misit sat down too, crossing their legs, and if not exactly little, the bushy blue-stem cozy, then armadillo tight, wanting now only to know what was inside. Damn it. Thank you, Cinemax. I will fix it. It had better be. It had better be better. Thank you for the head pats. Where was I? Following this example, Tarf, Izad, Inyadia, Sithis, and Misit sat down too, crossing their legs, and if not exactly little, and bushy bluestem cozy, then armadillo tight, wanting now only to know what was inside. As for the social worker, with her burden of watchful responsibility momentarily suspended, she took her place in a back corner lounge chair and, stretching out her legs, yawned. Chintana, as well, succumbed to her own shadows and seat, trying idly to figure out this figure's peculiar origins. The narrow eyes or sharp-squeezed brows, the profoundly wide forehead, or the dark lips rounding out into the deeper creases of his cheek, all mute and formless, but somehow adding up to something Chintana knew only as awfully, or perhaps it wasn't him at all, but another question of origin. The box he carried, a narrow thing with angles of black, 6 feet long, easy with an ochre sash for a handle. Above the odd engraving, T50YS. The 4 hinges faced in towards him. The 5 metal latches faced out towards the orphans. The number of latches confused her and warned her, but Chintana didn't know what to do with warnings anymore. Yellow is back and says, "What I have to tell you," he began slowly, "I must show you. But what I show you, I must also tell you. I have only myself and where I've been and what I found and what I now bring. And it will frighten you." This was not the way such tales for 5 such orphans usually began. Misit cocked her head to one side, and Azad's hands fuzzed in his pocket. Well, maybe there would still be some fun, Chintana mused. Maybe the storyteller's strange and pompous gravity would be refused with fitterings and frowns. Yet if the cloudy phrases released them, his ever so slight nod towards the box recaptured them. All I have to offer is right here to see, but if you scare easily, you should leave. Tarf looked at Azad, who looked at Inyadia, who looked at Sithis, who looked at Misit, who defiantly looked back at the dark man and his long box, with angles of black, and so they all stayed. I am a bad man, with a very black heart, and it was only that badness and blackness which forced me to seek out what I have carried now for many years, and brought this night for you. Because you are young, I will tell you I went in search of a weapon. But also because you are young, I will not tell you why I went in search of such a weapon, though in truth, while I could speculate, I am no longer capable of recalling the details myself. When you are older, you will be able to imagine what drove me on such a quest. You will know then more than me. But saying this, he did not look at the orphans, only at Chintana. And maybe it was a coincidence, but her thumb began to hurt a little more. At first, I went to places I knew. Familiar places. I examined ropes and knives of many sorts. I considered oils and poisons. I toyed with explosives. I handled guns. Small guns, big guns. Guns powerful enough to sever something, anything in half, with just one blast. Chintana shifted uncomfortably. Where were the animals, the gleefully abandoned, the stormy skies appropriate for a ghost story for the young? Where was the comedy? The social worker, however, seemed unconcerned. That or too exhausted to resist the comforts of her recliner. But none of it, the storyteller continued, could match my taste for what my blackness ceaselessly scratched for. And so I traveled farther and farther away, from north to south, mountain to valley, coast to coast, season by season, until I finally left the country on a ship, setting out for away in far places, where faces are different and songs cradle words neither you nor I have ever heard. And everywhere I stopped, everywhere I ate or drank or slept, I asked about a weapon. Yet even in those distant places I received the same response. Ropes, knives, poisons, explosives, and guns. I shook my head and my heart blackened more and my badness spread, so that whatever my badness touched too, and seeped into, until finally one night on the banks of a muddy flow, what some might call a stream, on the edge of another dirty city, I took cover from a rain beneath slabs of concrete twisted through with rusted rebar and pain. It was a shelter I soon discovered already populated by rats, but where I also overheard a story about a valley assault, and a forest of note, and a mountain of any one paths, and a man with no harms who made terrible weapons, which he sold, but never for money. Intrigued, I asked for a retelling of the story. Carefully then I listened, memorizing every detail, prodding him to reveal still more until I was satisfied he knew no more. And then I thanked him, and I killed him. Chintana jerked forward sharply, trying in vain to grab hold again of the words so casually uttered, so easily laid open, laid bare, unable to believe he'd said them in the first place. Even if Izad and Inyadia did whimper, and Misit's head bent down, her eyes suddenly fixed absidiarily on the worn, crim-stitched carpet. If only the social worker had given one indecitation of alarm, Chintana would have put a stop to the whole thing. But blinks too of misbelief, enforced presumably by her own torpidor, could merely put women on a temporary state of alert. Only his eyes, gray pools of glum like ice. Chintana... Oh, there we go. Thank you to this anonymous gifter for giving Cinemax a tier 1 sub. I will add a new voice on the next chapter, which is very soon, actually. Only his eyes, gray pools of glum like ice, told Chintana what he had just succeeded in doing. He had involved them, and what's more, had now made them accountable. Thank you for the hydrate, Fenny. There we go. And we're on red now. Soon then, his always low, rumbling voice continued. The gutters of cities, curious derelictions half buried in abandoned farmlands, poisonous pools lingering in ancient quarries, began to speak to me of a way. And I listened, and I followed. And after many months in roads strewn in ruin, I came upon a course to what I would call the Valley of Salt. There nothing moved, and I was alone. Anything that I had stumbled upon such a wide way of gray grief had not chosen to stay. Only shadows remained. Even mine left a charcoal smudge upon those dissected steeps. Perhaps we're still there today. And I saw remnants of many a strange shadow, too. Did you know stars have shadows? They do. And can you imagine what it feels like to walk upon the shadow of a day? I can't, but I don't have to. Soon, after a long stretch among these shades of the grave, I began to feel a staring dryness removing me from myself, and any chance I'd have to move. Conversely, my shadow mark seemed to assume increasingly the braid of substance, of location. A point wherein I grew still. But right when I felt I should have become nothing more than a staid crotch of black, and unbent dark like a spent moon, I found I had left the Valley of Salt and was now deepening into the forest of falling notes. So here you say in a forest, where I immediately found plenty of water, I should also find relief and rest. I thought the same. I even felt happy enough to sing a few notes. And sing the storyteller suddenly did, much to the amusement of the orphans and even Chintana. A series of clucks, trills, sputters, and odd clicks caught in whistles in the back of his throat. He grinned weirdly, and before... And there's some stuff that I'm not really sure how to say or pronounce or even read. But it's all stitched into the book as though it's part of the illustration. I don't know what to do with that. And it's also all stitched in gray. And it comes after a gray quotation mark. But then we're back to red. Stopping, even whommed. But this was the only song I sought to sing, not what ultimately spilled out of my lips. That sound was completely different. For you see, in the peculiar forest of falling notes, sounds could not hold together, like pearls on a snipped silk thread. They scattered wildly upon the ground. It did not matter the sort of sound, either. Whether a melody, a whistle, or even a nick-tick or clip-crip, all of it fell apart. It was even in the falling apart of a breeze. Though is there a breeze, if I can still feel it on my face? And in the falling apart of rustling needles and seeds. Though are there even these, if I can still feel them under my feet? I could only hear in the terrifying way all the sound of all the world there was constantly severed. Worse, what was initially curious and startling became more and more terrible, for I began to fear as the sound of my passage and even my own thoughts were disremattered, that I was with ever varied velocity going nowhere, that I had come from nowhere, that I was lost, and soon too, like the matter of my uncertain breath, would scatter among the turns of this unspeakable wood. Tarf with frowns, Izad, Inydia, and Sithis with exchanged glances, and It'll-Miss-It with a yawn, revealed then that they too were lost, and their attention scattering. But the storyteller missed nothing. Ah, yes, how hard it is to imagine the forest of falling notes, I know. And he lowered his head dramatically, causing the orphans to reflexively rock forward. Imagine, he said, pointedly, his eyes still lost in the downward tumble of his pose. Imagine every sound a sigh of but one thing dying. And instead of coming one after another, it sighs a sigh of all at once. What would that sound like? And finally, I'm back to yellow, which means I can go back to my normal voice. Only red is going to be that voice, by the way. So, yeah. And he raised his head to look at one of the windows. Thank you for the hydrate, Cinemax. And he raised his head to look at one of the windows, and Shintana felt something within her part like a wail. Butterflying hope and hold, not neither over the stabbing pain in her thumb, either which had clearly gotten a much, much worse, but over a horror far more simple. She knew the windows had all been closed. She remembered it clearly by the way the candles had burned, all 5 flames arrogantly vertical. Impervious. Now, though, the flames flickered wildly, dancing on the edge of annihilation as a shriek of wind, freeze, and sky whirled around the room. Somehow, one window was now wide open. Already the social worker had leapt up to close it, puzzled, confused, clearly too drowsy to pay too much mind. The storyteller had the answer, but he only looked at the orphans with his own questions, which they responded to, and in surprising unanimity, with a question of their own. Then what happened? I left gladly the forest of falling notes, only to find myself at the base of a precarious path, rising up through twisting leaps of snow, and looming boulders wrapped in pale wisps of always moving cloud. The mountain of many one paths had only one path as far as I could tell. Here at least my shadow traveled with me, and the songs I whistled made sense. In fact, the mountain seemed just a mountain. Only when I began the dangerous ascent did I perceive through the briefly parting veils of pollen mist another climber on what I admitted then had to be a second path. Soon, though, the figure was enveloped in white, never to be seen again. I had begun to forget the sighting, when on a completely different part of the mountain, below me this time, I momentarily caught sight of another climber on a third path. This time, I moved down a little in his direction, only to watch a twisting sheet of white wipe him from my sight. Nor was that the last time. On the contrary, it was the beginning. Climbers began to pop up all over the mountain, always on a different path, always swept away by mist before reappearing somewhere else. Eventually, though, I managed to get a little closer before the pale wind stole these solitary figures away, and it was then that I could see how all of them looked exactly the same, and not just the same as one another, but the same as me. And then we've got this really beautiful two-page spread of all the mountains, all stitched. Really, really pretty. Maybe I'll post it to the Discord later today after I'm done reading. And this also marks about halfway through the book. So we might actually do this in like 2 hours. Maybe even less. Or maybe we'll have like a little discussion at the end. And while to this day I cannot really tell you what took place on the Mountain of Many One Paths, I understand still that in spite of so many climbing figures on so many paths, I was completely alone up there. Far worse than the petrified shadows and the falling notes, the multiplication upon multiplication of my own solitude brought me repeatedly to the edge of despair, which is where, quite sensibly really, I finally found the man with no arms. First, there to greet me, though, was the soft lull of Osage orange and a burnt hush surrounding me, softening me, and how sleeping my strange travels had made me. So I fell, too, into a hammock hung between 2 black willows, 2 black hills, overleaning the edge of a pond where I slept for 3 days and 3 nights. And when at last I woke, I saw on the other side of that pond a small hut, the door wide open with smoke drifting up from a chimney somewhere off in the back. Upon entering, I found only 2 chairs at a tiny table supporting 1 large bowl of hot tea. I sat and drank all the tea, and when I lowered the bowl, I discovered something opposite me. The man with no arms. So startled by his presence, the grayness of his presence, gray hair, gray whiskers, gray eyebrows, grayer still his wide eyes, pupilless eyes, all of him gray except for his eyelashes, long willowy lashes rising out and up as if they were falling away from the earth itself. Not gray at all, but a luminous violet. I jerked backwards, dropping the empty bowl with a lingering clatter. And right then the storyteller also jerked back, his 2 hands pale as February, thrust out from underneath the silvery black tunic to ward off some wild apparition. His grin twisted into mock fear, startling the orphans into a laughter which, in their own way, elicited his own chilling laugh. "You have come a long way," the man with no arms said to me first. And I, in vain trying to locate the fallen bull, could only nod. "You have come for one of my swords." And again I nodded, though I had not known the weapons he made were swords. "You know they are expensive, but your heart is black, and price as much as you know what price is no matter for you." I said yes this time, and the man with no arms laughed like a corkscrew. Back to Red. Allow me to do one thing real quick. Okay. There we go. There were so many. And here we see a bunch of, here we see a new kind of illustration. A 2-page spread of a lot of swords. Or what we see is what appears to be a bunch of just randomly cut paper with some stitching on it. But if you look closely, you'll notice that all of the stitches are sword hilts. And most of the cut paper is extending from the hilts. And so it's portraying the cuts in the paper as the blades of the swords. I will also post this to the Discord later. Anyway, some so small they could barely reach halfway across one of your palms. Some, though, were wide as a stair, some wider than a road. Some curved like thunder. Some were straight like the sea's tides. Still others were thin like the breath of a June dew. And a few I saw waved like heat off an August noon. But as far as I could tell, all had the same type of blade. Milky white and glossy cold. Glossy and cold, a fog creeping low across the morning before a funeral. In fact, so curious was I about their composition, I reached out to touch one, and if not for a sharp click and a wild fluttering of his violet eyelashes, I would have succeeded. "They cut every time," warned the man with no arms. "Every time." Smartly, I withdrew. Here, he blinked quickly at a blade at least 4 feet long, tapering to a blunt tip. "This one took me 3 winters to make. It kills the taste of salt. The one next to it kills the smell of wild lupine, blackberry lily, and lush evening primrose. There," turning to a fat blade suspended in buzzing gray, "that one kills the color green." And the man with no arms grinned, because he already knew the darkness I guarded and with violent lash fluttering turned away from those tiny cuts and led me on to those deeper cuts, blinking in and out of the strange shift-thickening haze. Here only a few swords floated. "These ones take lives," his violet lashes battered. But unlike the smaller ones and the fat ones, they all appeared to be the same, sleek and long, and bowed like a theft. Ah, but they're not the same at all. Closest to you is a 10-year sword. That one's a 25-year sword. 100 above it, and there, a 287-year sword. And this one, I asked, tentatively reaching for the handle. Until unchecked, I actually took hold of it. That's your 50-year sword, he said oddly. You almost can't see the blade, I added, marveling at the way the weapon bit through the air. The way the finely carved handle, bound in a fine fall braid, beaded with winks of pale pearl, seemed with every swipe to melt into my palm. Oh, the man with no arms chuckled. You can never see the blade. Which I would not understand until I'd returned and found my blade had dissolved into breezes and hours. But will it kill? I wanted to know, dimly resenting him now that my sword hung once again in that flickering deep. In half a century, from birth to the final second of the 50th year. Every time, most of the time. This surprised me. Why most? No weapon is perfect. Whatever this blade passes through, it most certainly will divide, though there is one thing which can stitch and hold the wound. What's that? Ah, your heart is blacker than will ever be told. But that is why you're here. Beyond him, then, I caught sight of still more swords, though these were inconceivably long. For you, maybe, said the man with no arms. For me, they are as they are. Some a mile long, some a river long. There is one that is a sky long. They kill lives too. I suppose one sword will kill a season. One will kill a country. One I'm making now will kill even an idea. An idea, I pondered. But those are too expensive for you. And his violet lashes seemed to tremble with delight. How much? The wielder must die before wielding it. But I objected. Yes, it's tricky. Too tricky for you. As I already said, too expensive. Then the man with no arms led me back among the tiny and wavering swords. These cost a breath you may never take again. Those a feeling you may never shape again. Then his lashes quivered daintily. Beware, though, as all are double-edged, and come with this warning. Should a wound ever fail, you will vanish like the blade you wield. But I didn't care. What about the 50-year sword? Your sword? His violet lashes twitched slightly. I could not object. I knew, too, it was my sword. I knew when the handle melted beneath my fingers, and the blade shivered familiarly along my arm into my past. Yes, how much is my sword? A memory you have which would have outlived you. And before I had even finished saying agreed, the man with no arms somehow already held, clenched between his teeth, the handle of a sword, with a blade which swayed like a long blade of evening grass. Just as quickly, too, he slid behind me, and I felt a sting between my shoulder blades. And then a fire and a cold and a sudden something seep of hurt. And then my eyes dried up, and they also hurt. There, blinked the man with no arms, happily showing me what was now separate, suspended carefully in the air. A single harvester with dark orange wings struck through with light and dapples of bruised dark. What is it? I wanted to know. But his violet lashes flickered, as if now to say no. And he boxed up my 50-year sword, and never said more. And so I descended into the mountain of any one paths, crossing back through the forest of note, before finally making my way from the valley of assault. And only in the years to come would I realize what he had taken. My heart stayed just as black, and my badness spread more easily. But the memory and reason behind such badness and blackness had vanished completely. Which is my story. There is no more. And even if the storyteller had indeed cut himself short, which it seemed to Chintana he had, he gave no indecitation, only hunching his shoulders and lowering his eyes with a sigh. A sight so soaked with sadness, even the orphans responded to it. And right now, we're at another chapter border. Like, we're at the end of a chapter. But, somehow, it's still red. So I don't know what that means. But I'm going to stop here and pause for just a little bit to say that we are now at page 206. Out of, what did I say before? 285. So we're almost done, unfortunately, and I will have to find something else to do. And thank you for the super hydrate, Fenny. I appreciate the short break. There we go. And I just realized I don't have a proper back soon screen for this. Oh, excuse me. I wonder where it's going to go outside of the storyteller's story. Yeah, it's very interesting. Because right now I think we are at the... like, we're back in the... in the present. And I'm just going to go to PC Streams BRB. So you'll get to see that. And it doesn't make a lot of sense, but whatevs. Back soon! Okay, I'm back. And I've got a little bit of a cough drop in me. Which is very nice. I'm still kind of sucking on it a little bit, but it's nice. Thank you for the welcome back, Fenny. I am indeed super hydrated. I'm glad you did that. I needed not only that hydration, but I also needed that little bit of a break. Cough drops do not count as candy. And I don't know why you brought that up. I'm not doing anything to do with candy. I'm just reading a scary story for Halloween. Anyway. Before we continue, what if we talk a little bit about what we've done here so far? We've gone through a bunch of stuff. Yeah, I get that, but it's not... It didn't seem like the joke was relevant to what was going on. Like, to what is actually going on here currently. But anyway, while I'm finishing off this cough drop, I'd like to know, are people enjoying this story? Is there stuff going on that you're interested in? Any questions you would like me to answer about it? Any thoughts of any kind? If you'd like to know them. I am eager for questions, comments, anything of the sort. What's my headcanon about a weapon that can kill an idea? I'm not really sure. Like, there's a lot... Okay, this author does a lot of things with regards to, like, meta-storytelling. And so I kind of have this idea that a sword that can kill an idea is... like, maybe it's not really a headcanon, more like a head analysis or a head metaphor. My idea of it is like a weapon that can kill an idea is some piece of media that is that reaches so many people that it sort of creates a counter idea to another idea, if that makes sense. Like, I kind of feel like that sort of thing is like a sword that can kill a country, for example. Like, that could very easily refer to, like, propaganda towards a revolution. Like, in that sort of, like, in sort of a very literal sense of the pen is mightier than the sword. And I think killing an idea is kind of similar, if that makes sense. Like, both, I think, have to do with propaganda. Or are symbolic of propaganda. As for the misspellings, I think, at the very least, on a surface level, all of them are based in, like, they're all representative of one of the narrator's speech quirks. And, like, what that means for that particular narrator depends on who you think that narrator is. So, like, if you interpret one of the narrators as, say, Belinda Kite, who we haven't even... Actually, let's say Mose Dettle Down, because he may have been a witness to this. Like, if you interpret that particular narrator as being Mose Dettle Down, you might think that these misspellings are actually him making up big words in order to sound smart, because he's a high-class individual. Or if we interpret these 5 narrators as the 5 orphans, then it may be that it's one of these orphans who has, who's just mispronouncing normal words because they're very young and we don't know, and they just don't know how to pronounce these things, or they misheard it and are saying it again. Because they do seem to mostly be big words. I think it's in some way a reflection of who is speaking. And it's kind of meant to be a hint about who it is. Oh no, we have no idea who these 5 narrators are. We just kind of have little hints that let us interpret who they are. They may be characters in the book. They may be people who are completely unrelated. They may be any number of people. And then what's not really coming through is the fact that there's also lots and lots of nested quotation marks. It's like for each chapter is, like, if I were to get more than 5 subs for this whole event, what I would do is I would start doing a second voice for each internal quotation mark. Because, like, here we've got a red quotation mark, and then further down there's a smaller orange quotation mark inside of all of that. And so, like, I get this, like, the idea would be to not only be doing voices, but also doing voices. Which is where this idea of narrative layers comes from. Anyway, I'm done with that cough drop. So, let us continue with the next chapter, which is also inexplicably a red quotation mark. I made a mistake doing this specific voice for Red. Chintana knew better, though. She listened to her chest, which guarded a more subtle ear, and she acceptated the sharpening shrill of her thumb. For even as the social worker snored now in her recliner, and the storyteller seemed to recomport himself into an even smaller stillness, Chintana knew what the orphans were about to ask, which somehow meant she also knew he too knew what they would ask, and how he would answer. In fact, the only thing Chintana did not know was how she herself would respond. At least get up, she tried to tell herself, already on the edge of her seat, as if in the poison of a dream. She felt unable to move even an itsy bit. Tarf grunted then, refusing, unable to look away from the long box with its angles of black, and so asked, "Is that the sword?" And of course all 5 windows were open now, and the wind and falling clouds split apart with falling. Hail ripped into the room, and the 5 flames on 5 wicks on 5 candles of molasses, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and ginger shook and faltered. But no one here could heed the candles any more, or understand the shadows, or hear the notes, or follow the paths. Not even Chintana, who, try as she might, could still not wrench herself free. And here I should mention, I've got to turn the book sideways, because each of the next several pages is showing the box getting, the latches on the box opening. And so Tarf did as he was told, lifting the first latch. And so Azad did as he was told, lifting the second latch. And so Inyadia did as she was told, lifting the third latch. And so Sithis did as he was told, lifting the fourth latch. And so Misit did as she was told, lifting the last latch. And then all withdrew as the storyteller leaned forward and lifted the lid. And here we have 2 completely black pages with a long, thin strip of white down the middle. "Hey," Tarf immediately objected. "It's empty." "Yeah," Izad, Inyadia, and Sithis chorused. Misit even giggled. "The blade is missing." But the storyteller's lack of surprise reminded them, as he quietly reached in to pull free the finely carved handle, bound in fall braid, and beaded with winks of pale pearl. In fact, so mesmerized was everyone by the promise of its mild blend, that no one seemed to notice how the storyteller was already standing, filling the room, his shoulders expanding out to the walls, the back of his neck pressing up against the ceiling, all of him howling and gulking, his shadow falling not from but towards the terrified candlelight. Whereupon he began to swing the handle in a wide but deliberately slow arc, as if to pass a long blade through the wicks of those 5 candles, nearly 6 feet away, where indeed a yellow panic there, perhaps by extraordinary coincidence, momentarily cowered into small rounds of blue and drowning smoke. How his lips gleamed sharp red then, as gripping the handle with both hands, he raised it high above his head, twisting his shoulders away, though never relinquishing his gaze, fixed awfully on the orphans still seated at his feet. Instinctively, Izad and Tarf jerked their arms in front of their faces. Inyedia yelped. Sithis leaked out a whine. But Misit wailed. Chintana forced herself then from her chair, but she was too far too late. The storyteller already swinging down across the necks of the 5 orphans. A vicious and terrible round, with even worse implications if his hands hadn't clutched nothing at all. For indeed, at the height of their ruin, yet before their crime, they, those hands, pale as February, had been so seamlessly so, and so expertly so, stripped clean, replaced with a ladle of angry air. Tripe, hogwash, baloney, and hooey. Belinda Kite spat loudly, striding forward. The handle now, somehow, miraculously in her possession. How easily, too, it seemed she had just reached out of the shadows and plucked free from his glacial grasp the end of his story. Despite herself, Chintana was overjoyed, even if she also wondered what on earth could have prompted such a display of uncommon heroics. Had some protective instinct suddenly incitated she act on behalf of the orphans? Or was it just more evidence of Belinda Kite's natural predisposition to spoil a pretty gripping moment? Whatever the case, Belinda now dangled the curious handle between her 2 very nimble fingers. It's time to cut out such doo-doo. Look closely, my children. There is nothing but a bit of phony footy. Whereupon Belinda Kite, to further substantiate her claim, proceeded to swing and to no effect stab, gash, cross, flay, chop, slash, cube, pare, lop, perforate, puncture, slit, pierce, sunder, and jab the handle at herself, all over herself, around herself, like a cross. Through making sure to crisscross her knees, thighs, and waist, dice her fingers, wrists, elbows, and arms, sectioning, filleting, and lancing neck, jaw, nose, ears, and scalp. A complete hacking and desiccating of her body. Entire. No part of her uncut, untouched, or unmysticated. And everyone there, though no one else would have admitted the possibility that someone else had seen so, or saw so, caught a glimpse now and then of something slippery, biting through the air, white and vague, like a snow-coned fog creeping across an evening after a burial. And we're on orange now, I think. Yeah, that's orange. Belinda Kite sent the storyteller packing with his long box of black angles, and leave he did in the aftermath of the blizzard, even if no one saw him go. The social worker had loaded the children into the van, only to discover it wouldn't start. Chintana's jumper cables didn't help. A county clerk called a tow truck. Someone then remarked that the night felt wide and deserted. Without creature or comparison, rot of wood and mud mute, the kennels empty, not even a wing flinging its shady whisper over fields void of paw print, step, or even moon. In the kitchen, a caterer informed a just arriving and very harried schoolteacher that the children had left long ago, to which this very late teller of stories, the only one Mose Dettledown had hired, sighed heavily, abandoning at last his plans for animals and stormy nights in favor of a bowl of spaghetti, farfalla, a wedge of pear tart, and eventually a deep glass of scotch, all while he cursed his sedan and the early freeze. though still managing to make the caterer giggle with limericks of cutting the cheese. But the caterer was wrong. The children hadn't left just yet, and as Mindite approached, they were upstairs again, in the storytelling room. Mind waiting for their ride, revolting against sleep. Peering down at the guests gustering about outside in the snow on the back patio, where, with most of the caterers cut loose hours ago, a skeleton crew did their best to fast uncork bottles of sugary champagne and fill brim-high all of those plastic goblets. Somewhere someone began to sing. "None of that, thank you," Belinda Kite snapped. "Just raise up the bubbly and choke it back. Happy birthday to me, spoken will do." The woman with topaz clamped on her ears was the first to scoop a second fill, no doubt to take the edge off. Many were very drunk, but no one was cut off. Chintana, without a glass of anything to fortify herself against the biting cold, didn't know what to make of why everyone else, including herself, had agreed to stand outside. Belinda Kite, because she claimed to adore the snow, had demanded her toast take place in it. And for some reason, everyone obliged, though Chintana could see not many liked it, and even less liked Belinda, focusing instead on the champagne, the clicking of plastic on plastic rim, anything and everything but Belinda. Thank you for lurking, Cinemax. And then swiftly. Oh, also, we're on the black and or dark brown quotes again. And then swiftly, as the moments edged closer to midnight, closer ever to Belinda Kite's 50th birthday, Chintana, with whirls of butterflies suddenly panicking inside her, so sunflower wild, began to understand something she could not have prepared herself for. No matter, Belinda Kite had desecrated everything that had mattered to Chintana, everything that had made sense. No matter, Chintana now moved through light and stream a grave, by tense of indecent rage. Chintana still chose not to abandon Belinda Kite. And so as seconds flickered, seconds on seconds from 12s like long, violent lashes, Chintana forced herself from the promise of infliction's peace. It was, after all Chintana had of her. It was, in fact, all Belinda Kite had of herself. That once ago frail embroidery her fingers had nimbly and tenderly stitched and bled upon, finding in grassy thread the shape of a single harvester with dark orange wings, long gone, yet by which Chintana could now clearly find, recovering it, reminding it, re-releasing it as she had immediately remembered when Pravit had at last handed it over to her. For this is what hurts so much. And we see again the butterfly stitching, now almost finished. No deceit at all, but the reach only from a longing and already parting woman, a reach which tonight from this same woman had also saved 5 children from the murder of fate. And so Chintana tried hard to keep breathing, even as her thumb throbbed terribly and a solitary tear sliced down her cheek, which was when clock hands across Upshur County finally clasped limnly around midnight and said goodbye, which was when Belinda Kite caught sight of Chintana coming apart, figuratively with a tear, that is, and sneered. "Baby, your hubby was a lousy fuck." And now we're at regular brown. From their window, the children were the first to see the snow splash red. even before Belinda Kite knew what was happening, before she could make sense of the muffled screams and recoil suddenly unrounding her as she, right on the spot, literally went to pieces. Tarf, Inyadia, Misit, Izad, and Sithis saw all 5 fingers slide away and tumble to the ground in a soundless spray of blood. But even as slices of joints and nails scattered apart on the frosty stone, followed by the slow tumbling slivers of the rest of Belinda Kite's hand, gold bangles loose too, Chintana was already racing forward, duretisating others to call for help. Reaching, oh how she reached for her, until she was reaching Belinda Kite, grabbing her, holding her, cradling her in her arms, wrapping her up tight in her gravecoat, the scarf tight around the tortured arm, stroking the woman's head, which she understood at any moment could also fall away. And so, though Chintana kept calling aloud for someone, for anyone inside, she quietly continued to accept this mercy-laden, merciless agony of what only survives as entirely personal. Without witness, all that really matters here, hers herself for now, holding on to it patiently, like she held on to, just as she held on to Belinda Kite, gently and painfully and gratefully too, acceptating them all, and with great sloppy breaths too, even if she also continued to wonder just how long one such tiny stitch of, well, you know, could really hold. And we end on a closing, not parenthesis, on a closing quotation of light purple. A very specific purple, which is actually very relevant to the very last, or to a very important character in this author's first book, House of Leaves. I will leave that to you to discover yourself. Stitching by Atelier Z, in alphabetical order, Regina Gonzalez, who is, I believe, now Mark's wife, so congratulations to them, Claire Cohn, and Michelle Riverte. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Special thanks to Tyler Martin, N8 Reitmeyer, and Peter von Sambeek for the ongoing inspirations of their talents, and all their dedication inspires. With additional thanks to VEM for vocal mesh and identity pattern tracing. All I take I do, all I made I lose, all I left I let another take to use. And here finally is the finished butterfly, which I'll also post in the Discord as soon as I'm done here. And on the opposite end is the opposite side of the stitching of the butterfly. I'm glad you appreciated it, Fenny. This didn't take as long as I was expecting. Like, this took, like, 2/3 to half as long. But it's good content, and I'm glad I did it. Tuesday when going to and back from campus. That's good to know. I'm glad you'll be re-listening to it. I'll make sure... Twitch has, like, exclusivity to the content, like, between, like, for the first 24 hours after the stream ends. But, yeah. I hope you enjoy, Fenny, for your second listen to it. It's a good book. I can highly recommend having a full copy, like a hard copy of it, because the illustrations are really, really pretty. It's got a nice textured cover. Really, really, really good. Oh no, what I mean is, like, I can very easily export it to YouTube. I just have to wait 24 hours after I end the stream. And even then, I can export it to YouTube right away. I just have to wait until 24 hours later to publish it. So I'll do that as soon as I end the stream, and then I'll just set it to 24 hours from now to release. And yeah, I'm sure you do have lots of books to read. It would be nice to be in that same position. Maybe at some point I'll read more of more of this author's work. Maybe for future story times. Anyway, to anybody who is still left here, are there any thoughts on anything? Thoughts, theories, comments, questions, etc., etc. I am happy to continue. And that I can never find the motivation. True! Same here. Same here. I've got a big part of the Storytime redeem is just that I want to read things, but I don't have the time or motivation to do so in my normal life, so I use streams for that. And it usually works out pretty well. And it has been working out pretty well so far. The next book that I want to read on stream is the next book that I want to read on stream is actually a book that I want to finish before I read it on stream. Yeah. Okay. I kind of think there's enough ambiguity that it could be anyone. Like, it could be a lot of people. But I think canonically we're meant to think it's the orphans. But I think we're meant to think it's the orphans later in life. Like, being interviewed for an investigation years later. To see into what happened to Belinda Kite. And I think they, have not recounted it perfectly, but have done the best they could. And the result is a ghost story, as was described in the very, very beginning, with that weird description of what the nature of ghost stories is. And also that very beginning kind of hints that, like, the very beginning where it says, who each of the, like, where each narrator is in their life, to me that says that it's probably the orphans. Because it's specifically describing their relationships to each other and what's going on in their lives now. But it could be a lot. I think the only person who is probably definitely not one of the narrators is the storyteller. Because I get the sense that he kind of just disappeared. The orphans seem to be the most obvious pick. Yeah, yeah. To me, that's pretty obvious. I also kind of have a headcanon that the storyteller is Pravit, Chintana's ex-husband. And I think that the 5 orphans have something to do with why they divorced. And his price for the 50-year sword was the memory of having been with Chintana. Which is why he still wants revenge, but he doesn't remember why he wants revenge. If I can think of a theory that one could argue for. Okay, yeah, definitely. Like, we also know that Chintana and the social worker were both there for the entire time. We also know that Belinda Kite... We also know that Belinda Kite could not be the one of the narrators, unless she actually isn't dead. But the book makes it very clear that nothing in this is true in the way that things actually happened. It's like a truth that can be derived from these events, or from having witnessed these events. So, let's say it is, let's say the moment when Belinda Kite fell apart, maybe that was witnessed by one of the orphans. Because that's only recounted by one source, it seems. And so, maybe it's one of the orphans who saw that, but actually it was like some kind of magic trick that was going on. And they just thought she died. But then what was the thing with Chintana going and seemingly trying to save Belinda? Like, there's a lot of stuff to go on here. There's a lot of interpretation that you have to do. Yeah. It's good. Yeah, lots and lots of speculation. Like, that's very common for a lot of... speculation is like the theme of all of this author's work. Like, speculation and ambiguity and layers of narratives. Like, here we've got... Like, in the 50-Year Sword, we have this layer of... First, us at the top layer reading the story and being told specifically that it is based on true events that have been shifted and distorted over time to the point that it is now definitely not what actually happened. And then we've got the storytellers who are all we've got all of the storytellers, the narrators we've got all of the narrators who are actually telling the story, presumably to an interviewer who is documenting the story. So not only do we have us reading the story and the documentation of the story, and the people telling the story, we've also got another narrative layer, which is the story that the storyteller is telling. And we don't know how true any of that is. Especially because there are 2 names for each of the places that he goes through. There's... Okay. There's both the Valley of Salt and the Valley Assault, which are two different things. Like, I'll put them in the chat right now. The Valley of Salt versus the Valley Assault. Which is itself a very difficult pun to decipher. Or you've got the Forest of Note versus the Forest of Falling Notes. And what that means, nobody knows. Other than the fact that one means there is something noteworthy about the forest, and the other is referring specifically to the musicality of the forest. It's very strange. Like, if you liked this, I feel like the next place to go in this author's body of work would probably be Only Revolutions. But that is very, very, how do I put it? That is extremely difficult to comprehend. Allow me to grab the book real quick off my shelf. And I'll just turn to a page and read off that. Strange is probably the best adjective. Abstract, obscure. Abstract is very good, yeah. Like, let me read the first page of Only Revolutions. Samsara, grand. I can walk away from anything. Everyone loves the dream, but I kill it. Atlas mountain cedars gush over me. Up boogaloo. I leap free this spring on fire. How my hair curls. I'll destroy the world. That's all. Big ruin all around. With a wiggle, with a waggle, a spin. Almighty 16 and free. Rebounding on bare feet. Trembling aspens are pretty here. You've nothing to lose. Go ahead. Have it all. Tamarack pines away scared. Appalled. All so pretty. Perfumed. Why don't I have any shoes? And then the gimmick of this book is that you read 8 pages, right? And then you close the book, you flip it over, and you read 8 pages on the other side. Because this is actually 2 books. And these are 2, how do I put it? These are 2, like, intertwining narratives. Being told by 2 different characters from 2 different perspectives. And the first page of the other side goes, Halos, Hailscarth, contraband. I can walk away from anything. Everyone loves the dream, but I kill it. Bald eagles soar over me. Reveille, rebel. I jump free this wheel. On fire, blaze a breeze. I'll devastate the world. No big deal. New mutiny all around. With a twist, with a smile, a frown. Almighty 16 and so free. Rebounding without even a cap. Golden bears bow at my knee. Go ahead, general. Take it all. American beavers also chitter, scared. Bowing, fawning too. Why don't I have a hat? And then as you go through, you consistently go through and you keep going with that pattern of you do 8 pages of Sam and then 8 pages of Haley, or the other way around. Doesn't really matter which one you start on. 8 pages of Sam, 8 pages of Haley. And then you gradually get toward the middle, and they start to intersect more and more and more. until it's not really clear which side you're on. And the whole thing is basically a love story, I think. But it's a very it's a love story specifically between Sam and Haley, describing what they are like and how they know each other and why they need each other. And the whole "why don't I have a hat" thing, that's the other thing about this is that it's cyclical, which means if you don't read it the way that I described, where you read 8 pages and then 8 pages on the other side, if you just read it all the way through, all 360 pages, you can then turn the book upside down and continue the story from the ending of the other story. Thus the title, Only Revolutions. It's very interesting. And part of the whole hat thing is well, yeah, cyclical was the word you just said, right? I don't think I've heard that out loud before. Yeah, cyclical. You got it right. Like, so the whole thing is in a cycle. It just goes back and forth until you decide to stop reading. And it's even to the point where on the paperback version, there's 2 separate barcodes, which are exactly the same, but one is upside down compared to the other. There's 2 logos for the
yeah, it's not bad.
For the publisher called Pantheon. And it even has 2 it even has 2 I don't know what they're called. Like, it has 2 embeddings of a little medal on it that says it's a National Book Award finalist on either side. It's interesting, and I really like it. That's another one that I would like to read on stream sometime, but that will take a while. And it's also, like, got some stuff that may not be okay to say on stream in it, so I'm not going to worry too much if I can't ever do it. We'll figure it out. It's also got a really good audiobook, too, so there's that. Read by, I believe, the author and his wife, I want to say. And that's got all kinds of stuff, like little musical bits and stuff like that kind of describe pretty well the rhythm of the book. As long as you're quoting and stuff, you should be alright. Yeah, but even so, there comes a point where, like, I just don't know, honestly. Because there's stuff that I would like to do, but I just don't feel like dealing with the potential problems that may or may not come with saying this stuff. You know, it's all a big thing. You know? Anyway, let's go back to Twitch and see who we can raid. I've only got 2 people, but still. Let's see. I've got somebody reading Lovecraft. And he's only got one viewer, it seems. Let's head over to him. You're welcome, Finny. You're welcome. /raid. Guest. Yeah, it is. There aren't that many people streaming in it, but it's nice that it exists. ! Raid. So we know what my raid messages are. As always, anybody who is watching can use that top. Anybody who is subscribed can use that top thing. Let's go give A Man Reading Lovecraft a try. Let's also... And yeah. Bye!